Two things before we get started today. One, there are weird pronunciations in this one. I'm looking them up when I can. I have a laptop right here. Sometimes it doesn't exist. Sometimes there just aren't the pronunciations available. I'm doing my best, but have a go at me in the comments if you want. Second thing, this video is brought to you by Squarespace. Whether you need a domain, website, or online store, make it with Squarespace. Check out squarespace.com for a free trial. Find a link below. Alright, so for 3 years and 8 months, Pol Pot ruled over Cambodia with an iron fist. The legacy that he left is horrific. Millions of families were torn apart, hundreds of thousands were terribly tortured, and 1.7 million of his own people were put to death. So how did it end this way? Well, in this week's Biographics, we attempt to seek answers as we delve into the life of Pol Pot. The man who the world would come to know as Pol Pot was born Saloth Sar on January the 25th, 1925 in the small village of Praksabov in Cambodia. His was a peasant family, and from an early age he found himself working long hours in the rice fields. The Saloth clan were better off than many, being landowners who worked their own rice fields. Sar's father, Loth, owned 9 hectares and would employ local workers at harvest time. His mother, Soknem, was a devoutly religious woman who brought up her children as Theravada Buddhists. Sar was the second to youngest of 9 children, however, 3 of them died early. According to his brother, Nehep, Sar was a considerate, kind, and hard-working child. During the day, he and his brothers would work in the fields, then play in the rivers and on the outskirts of the jungle. In the evening, they would gather around an open fire and sing the teachings and histories of a local religious leader. For the vast majority of rural Cambodians, life revolved around the rice fields in the village. Few ever travelled beyond the borders of their birthplace. However, Loth wanted his sons to experience more from life, so when he was 6, Sar and his older brother were sent to the Cambodian capital, Phnom Penh. Loth had a cousin by the name of Meek who was employed as a consort to the King of Cambodia, and the boys were sent to live with him. No longer considered as peasants, Sar and his brother were now among the privileged. As such, they were educated by the French colonial rulers in a school where the teaching was done in the French language. Sar studied French literature and history, filling his head with the events of the 1789 French Revolution and the Reign of Terror that followed under the orchestration of Maximilien Robespierre. Former schoolmates remember that Sar was a quiet, introspective young man who kept his thoughts to himself. He was an average student at best, apparently being held back 2 years. Most of his classmates were the children of French officials or Catholic Vietnamese. Cambodia was officially a monarchy, but the king, he ruled in name only, with the real power lying with the French colonial government. At this time, the French were tied up in a bitter struggle to hold on to their power in neighboring Vietnam. There, the Communist Army under Ho Chi Minh was leading the struggle for independence. The Vietnamese revolutionaries had started to train small groups of Cambodians and infuse them with the desire for independence from this European rule. This was a movement that was spreading throughout all of Indochina at this time. At the age of 20, Sir travelled with some friends on a pilgrimage to the famous temples at Angkor Wat. This site was the rallying point for Cambodian nationalistic pride. The trip left a lasting impression on the young man. In 1977 he stated, "If our people could build Angkor Wat, they could do anything. We must revive our national soul and pride in order to defend the nation, build the country well, and preserve it forever." The trip marked the awakening of Sar's political consciousness and his drive for independence. In 1947, he passed the exams and gained entrance into Lycée Sisowath, a secondary college in Phnom Penh. But the following year, he failed the entry exam into the upper classes and he had to leave the school. With his academic career seemingly at a standstill, he began to study carpentry. Then, in 1949, he won a scholarship to study at an elite engineering school in Paris. For the first few months, he indulged in the excesses that Parisian social life had to offer, but things changed when he came into contact with some fellow Cambodians who had views that built upon the spark of nationalist pride that had been ignited at Angkor Wat. The group began meeting at Tsar's apartment, and discussions soon led to the formation of two groups. One who advocated working peacefully towards independence from the French, and the other who were in favor of armed resistance. From the very start, Tsar was in the latter camp. He and his like-minded friends, they pointed to other countries around the world where armed overthrow was working, and they noticed they all had one thing in common. The rebels were all communists. There was a vibrant communist movement in Paris at the time, and Tsar and those of his group who were for armed rebellion began attending meetings. Tsar began studying the teachings of Karl Marx, but found them difficult to understand. However, he readily cottoned on to the writings of Joseph Stalin and became a lifelong advocate of Stalinism, with its emphasis on rapid industrialization, totalitarian government, and the cult of personality. In 1951, he joined the Communist Party, and by the time that he returned to Cambodia in 1953, he had committed himself to the cause of the Cambodian Revolution. Once back on Cambodian soil, Sir journeyed north to join up with Cambodian forces who had attached themselves to the Vietnamese communists in their fight for independence from the French. He now lived in the jungle as a prospective guerrilla fighter, but first he had to do an apprenticeship. For the first few months, his duties consisted of maintaining the group's vegetable patch. He later recalled, "Most everyone there was Vietnamese. There were very few Cambodians. For a long time, there was nothing for me to do. After a while, they let me work in the kitchen, but really, the Cambodians were there in name only." Victory was achieved by the Vietnamese communists in 1953 following the French disaster at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. The French pulled out of not just Vietnam, but Cambodia also. However, the new nationalist Cambodian government was headed not by a communist, but by the king, Norodom Sihanouk. Still, the top third of Cambodia was under the control of Viet Minh. Sir and other local communists urged the Viet Minh to continue pushing south until the entire country was communist, but the leadership of the Viet Minh resisted this urge, and a truce was arranged with the king. Sir now returned to Phnom Penh, where he continued to work for the political underground. His day job was as a school teacher, where he taught history. By night, however, he worked to establish contacts with every strata of society, from intellectuals to peasants, in order to garner support for the coming communist revolution. Around this time, Sir met the man who would become his closest political associate and second-in-command, Nuon Chea. Chea later recalled that Sir had an innate ability to charm people and bring them into the party, having the ability to explain things in a way that simple people were able to understand. Sir also met up with a revolutionary student who he had worked with in Paris by the name of Keng Vansak. Together they worked on plans for the country's first free and open political elections. Sir went to Vansak's house for breakfast every morning to work on their party's manifesto. However, their work did not come to fruition. King Sihanouk had renounced his throne and formed his own political party, the Sangkum. He threw his hat into the 1955 general election and won, becoming Cambodia's new prime minister. Sihanouk had achieved this victory, though, by throwing his political rivals into prison. For Sir, the sham election marked the end of any hopes he may have had for a democratic means to bring about change in his country. He confirmed his commitment to violent overthrow and threw himself towards working toward that goal. In July of 1956, Sir married a fellow Communist Party member by the name of Khieu Panari. Like Sir, she had been educated in France and was equally committed to the revolutionary cause. They soon became the power couple of the underground communist movement. Life was increasingly dangerous for the communists under the rule of Sihanouk. He had outlawed the Communist Party and given them a new name, the Khmer Rouge. The pace of imprisonments, killings, and general terror was stepped up as the Prime Minister sought to stamp out any and all opposition to his rule. The Communist Party secretary, a close friend of Sir, was taken to the outskirts of Phnom Penh and killed. It was during this climate of fear that Sir accepted the leadership of the Khmer Rouge. He was constantly followed by the police, who knew who he was, but not his position in the party. By 1963, things had gotten too hot for Sir in the capital city, and he left to dwell in the jungle in the north. Here, he was taken in by the Viet Minh, who had set up camps on the Vietnam-Cambodia border. They were now focused on a new enemy within their country, that's of course the United States. From their Cambodian bases, they would regularly travel into Vietnam to make lightning strikes before retreating back over the border. In response, the Americans dropped hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs in North Cambodia in an attempt to kill the Viet Minh. In the process, they killed, over the course of the war, nearly 150,000 Cambodians. The American bombing had the effect of drawing more and more people to the Khmer Rouge, and soon Sir no longer had to rely only on the Viet Minh. He now had his own guerrilla camps stretched out along the border. And he had transformed himself in the mold of his hero, Joseph Stalin. He was the unquestioned party leader, and he now went by the name Pol Pot. He lived apart from the rank and file of his army and only allowed a select few the privilege of having an audience with him. Pol believed that the lifeblood of his revolutionary forces would come from the peasantry, but he also believed that they needed to be molded so their sole allegiance was to the party. New recruits would undergo an intense period of initiation where they would be locked in a cell until they were proven to be obedient. Pol instituted a rigid disciplinary structure which included group meetings where members had to confess their weaknesses and seek forgiveness. In 1970, Prime Minister Sihanouk was overthrown by a military dictatorship. He escaped to the north and sought to establish an alliance with his former enemy, the Khmer Rouge. Bolstered by the supporters of Sihanouk, the Khmer Rouge numbers rose by 64,000 by the spring of 1964. Many of them were now armed with Chinese-supplied rifles. Pol Pot's army had gradually filtered down from the border area and now controlled 2/3 of Cambodia. By December of 1974, Pol felt in a strong enough position to make an assault on the capital. The Khmer Rouge encircled Phnom Penh and began to close in. Those who could fled the city as the streets became war zones. Within 5 days, the military government was overpowered and the revolution was over. April the 17th, 1975, was day zero in the life of a new Cambodia. Cambodia was now called Kampuchea, and it was under the control of its Stalinist leader, Pol Pot. Now, just before we get into the really dark part of this video, Pol Pot's reign of terror, I do want to thank today's sponsor. I know ads in the middle of these videos are a little bit disruptive, but these sorts of videos, I think they're important to make, and they would be impossible without our sponsors, so I really do hope in exchange for this long video about the life of Pol Pot, you won't mind a quick word from the fantastic Squarespace. If you've got an important message to share, you can do it with Squarespace. Or maybe you're like me and you need a place on the web for people to find you. Or maybe you're starting a new business and you need to set up a website for an online presence or a store. Well, you should do all of that with Squarespace. And with Squarespace, it all starts with a stunning template. They really are super good looking. Or if you hate their beautiful templates, I promise you won't. You can start from scratch and make your own. Squarespace make it all super easy to make something that looks amazing. Furthermore, you can easily move over an existing domain, and if you've hosted websites anywhere else, just move over to Squarespace. It's easy to do, and then everything after that point is just a lot easier. With Squarespace, there's no patches, there's no updates, there's no tech crap that you have to deal with all the time. No one likes any of that. Further, Squarespace does have 24/7 support. Before making this ad, I went on and I tried it to see if I could reach someone just randomly, and absolutely could. Solid support, it just works. Look, whatever you need a website for, whether it's for yourself or a business, Squarespace is the place to do it. Head to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/biographics and you'll get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring. Check them out through the link below. And now let's get back to the misery that is Pol Pot. The people of Phnom Penh, they enthusiastically welcomed the Khmer Rouge, but their smiles turned to alarm at the ruthlessness of Pol's men. They shot any military forces on sight. Then Pol ordered a mass evacuation of the capital. The reason given was that the Americans were about to bomb Phnom Penh. Khmer Rouge soldiers went into the city, forcing people out of hospitals and their homes. Many died in the streets in the melee that followed. The reality was that there was no threat of an American air raid. Pol Pot simply wanted to get the people out of the way so that he could concentrate on rebuilding his new society. He told his aides that they must use cutting-edge violence in order to build a socialist system from the ground up. The 2 million people who were forced out of Phnom Penh had to pass through Khmer Rouge checkpoints on the outskirts of the city. There, they were assigned to districts for re-education as field labourers. The policy of equality was strictly enforced, with any possessions that set city folk apart from the peasantry being taken off them. Khmer Rouge soldiers went through the now deserted capital and destroyed any of the trappings of modern civilization that they could find. Any people who were found to be hiding were taken into the street and shot. Under Pol Pot's regime, communist equality meant that everyone was to be a peasant. As a result, all of the modern advances of the last 100 years, they were rejected, and even though former city dwellers and peasants were now working in the fields side by side, their Khmer Rouge overseers held a special hatred for the former urbanites who were considered to be capitalists. They were given only half of the food rations of the peasants. The equality policy included children who had to live with Khmer Rouge teachers from the age of 7 onwards. Private thoughts and feelings were considered to be evil, with uniformity the only acceptable way of life. The state would choose which people got married, and anyone who was suspected of falling in love outside of this arrangement were beaten to death in public. The Khmer Rouge regime outlawed any form of entertainment, including sports, with former sports fields and basketball courts being planted as rice fields. The feeling of terror that had been generated reached into the echelons of power, with members of Pol's government eager to prove that they too were peasants and they worked in the fields. As a result, there was no real government. Pol instituted a rice harvesting quota on the people, which was 3 tons of unhusked rice per hectare. But less than a third of this was actually being produced. Meanwhile, the people were suffering physically. Disease was rife and millions suffered from malnutrition. Hundreds of people were dying every single day. Pol blames the lack of success of his great vision on infiltrators and enemies of the party. He devised a great purge to weed out those nonconformists. A state secret interrogation center was set up to imprison and torture those who were expected of being traitors. The families of those arrested would also be taken to the prison and tortured. If a child was too young to be interrogated, it would be taken away and simply killed immediately. Any adults who survived their torture were taken out to the killing fields and beaten to death. Of the 14,000 prisoners who passed through the gates of the main interrogation center in Phnom Penh, only 7 survived. Many of those killed were loyal Khmer Rouge supporters who were falsely accused of treason. Pol Pot had succeeded in imposing his ruthless, iron-fisted control within the borders of Cambodia, but there was a new threat to his regime just over the border. The Vietnamese, having seen off the Americans, now turned their attention on Cambodia. A border dispute threatened to bring these two countries to war. As the tensions were rising, Pol ordered his latest purge right on the border zone. He suspected his defensive forces in that area of colluding with the Vietnamese. After being viciously interrogated, more than 100,000 soldiers and party officials, along with their wives and their children, were executed. As a result of this wholesale massacre of his own defense forces, Pol left his eastern border with Vietnam open to invasion. And that invasion came on Christmas Day, 1978, taking just 13 days for the capital of Phnom Penh to fall. Pol Pot managed to slip away and escape into the jungle, but at least his 3.5-year reign of terror was over. In total, it had cost the lives of nearly 2 million people. The Khmer Rouge may have been over, but the party persisted. For nearly 20 years, a remnant continued to wage guerrilla warfare from its jungle bases. Pol Pot set up a base near the Thai border and rebuilt his military force with the aid of the Chinese and Thai governments. Meanwhile, the Vietnamese had installed a new government made up of Khmer Rouge supporters who had escaped Pol's purges. From his base in the northern part of the country, Pol gave occasional interviews to reporters in which he would invariably accuse those who opposed him of being traitors. In 1985, it was announced that he was retiring from the leadership of the Khmer Rouge. Shortly thereafter, the Vietnamese clamped down on the Khmer Rouge, moving into their stronghold and decimating their bases. Pol managed to escape into Thailand, where he remained for the next few years. In 1988, he went to China to undergo treatment for cancer. The Vietnamese withdrew from Cambodia in 1988, prompting Pol to return from Thailand. For the next 8 years, the Khmer Rouge ran guerrilla operations against government forces. In 1996, the government began engaging in peace negotiations with individual Khmer Rouge leaders, leading many of them to defect away from the organization. Meanwhile, Pol had suffered a stroke and was paralyzed down the left side of his body. But this didn't stop him from handing out death sentences. When he heard that his longtime right-hand man Son Sen was negotiating with the government, he ordered his arrest and execution. Around this time, 11 members of Pol's family were also killed, though it is unclear whether he ordered those killings. On June the 19th, 1997, Pol was arrested by the head of the Khmer military, who had had enough of his murderous ways. A show trial was conducted for the ordering of the execution of Son Sen, and Pol was confined to house arrest for the rest of his life. In his final years, Pol had become an avid listener to the Voice of America radio show. On the night of April 17, 1998, he was surprised to hear that the Khmer Rouge had agreed to hand him over to an international tribunal for crimes against humanity. Later that night, he died in bed. Pol Pot's body was requested by the Cambodian government for inspection. However, he was cremated by his followers before the government could get their hands on it. This has led people to speculate that he actually committed suicide rather than being handed over to the court. As a result, neither he nor anyone else has ever faced justice for the horror of Cambodia's killing fields. So I'm not going to ask whether you enjoyed that video, but I do hope you found it informative and maybe brought this part of history to light for you. If you did like it, please do give us a thumbs up below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell if you do want to hear about our videos. Just hitting subscribe doesn't do what it used to on YouTube, so do hit that bell as well so you do find out when we put out new videos. And if you're looking for something else to watch right now, why not check out some other bios linked to on the screen now. And as always, thank you for watching.